Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the history of Baton Rouge. Before we start, I invite you to write in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We want to know which places these accounts reach and at what hours of the day or night they are heard. On the morning of August 23, 1848, a local merchant named Richard Caldwell was walking along a muddy track beside the eastern banks of the Mississippi River, just outside the growing settlement of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The air was heavy with heat and moisture, as it often was in the late summer months. What caught his eye, and what would later be recognized as the first recorded evidence in the Whitmore-Broussard case, was an abandoned carriage. One of its wheels was sunk deep into the soft mud of the riverbank. Inside the carriage, Caldwell found almost nothing. There was a single glove, a man's leather ledger with no writing inside, and, strangely, a silver locket that held no photograph. The carriage carried the mark of the Whitmore Plantation, one of the larger estates located about 5 miles east of the city. By midday, when Caldwell reported his discovery to the Baton Rouge constable, it was noted that no one from the Whitmore household had come into town for nearly 3 weeks. This alone was not especially odd, as plantation owners often stayed on their land for long stretches, particularly during harvest time. However, Samuel Whitmore was known for being extremely careful about his business habits. He visited the First Bank of Baton Rouge every Thursday without exception. Bank records reviewed later showed that Whitmore had missed 3 weeks in a row without sending any explanation. The constable, James Harrington, sent 2 deputies to the Whitmore plantation later that afternoon. What they found there became the basis of one of the most disturbing documented cases in the history of East Baton Rouge Parish, a case that, for reasons that would later become clear, was intentionally kept out of official records for nearly 70 years. According to the deputies' first report, the main house looked completely normal. The 27 enslaved people working the cotton fields continued their labor as usual. The house servants carried out their tasks. Food had been cooked and served. Beds had been neatly made. Everything suggested that the Whitmore family was simply elsewhere on the property, but they were not.
Samuel Whitmore, age 46, his wife Elizabeth, age 42, and their 3 grown children, Thomas, 23, Catherine, 20, and William, 18, were nowhere to be found. The only person who seemed out of place was Adeline Broussard, a house slave around 30 years old. According to the other servants, she had begun sitting perfectly still in the parlor whenever she was not performing her duties. When questioned by the deputies, none of the enslaved people reported anything unusual. Every one of them gave the same answer, spoken in nearly the same words. Master Whitmore has gone to visit his brother in Natchez. He is expected back before the harvest. Samuel Whitmore had no brother in Natchez. In fact, according to all existing records, he had no brothers at all. In the weeks that followed, a quiet investigation took place. Nearby plantation owners were questioned. They acknowledged that the Whitmore family was gone, yet none of them seemed worried. Like the slaves on the property, they accepted without hesitation that the family had simply left for a time. When pressed for details, they grew uneasy and quickly changed the subject. Parish records from September 1848 show that a more formal inquiry was quietly started by Judge Martin Lambert, a business associate of Samuel Whitmore. Lambert was the first to note what he described as the strange silence surrounding the entire case. In his private journal, found many years later, he wrote that it was not only that the family had vanished, but that no one seemed willing to talk about it, as if the whole community had silently agreed to look the other way. By October 1848, the Whitmore family was still missing, yet the plantation continued to run as if nothing was wrong. The harvest moved forward on time. Cotton was gathered, processed, and sent to market. Profits were deposited into the Whitmore account at the First Bank of Baton Rouge. Bank documents show that the deposits were approved with a signature matching Samuel Whitmore's, even though the man himself was never seen. It was during this time that reports about Adeline Broussard's behavior began to spread. The house slave who once sat silently in the parlor was now seen using the master bedroom. Quiet stories later written down by Lambert claim that she had begun wearing Elizabeth Whitmore's dresses and jewelry.
Even more troubling were accounts that Adeline had started speaking as if she were Mrs. Whitmore herself, giving instructions in a perfect copy of the missing woman's voice and manner. The other house servants, clearly afraid, obeyed her without question. In his private notes, Judge Lambert described speaking with a field slave named Moses, who had been caught trying to escape the plantation in early November. Moses allegedly told Lambert that there were no Whitters anymore, and that Miss Adeline said there never had been. Lambert noted that after Moses was returned to the plantation, he was never seen again. His absence was explained as a successful escape, even though patrols had been doubled after his first attempt. By December 1848, a disturbing pattern was clear. The Whitmore plantation continued to operate. Business deals were made, cotton was sold, supplies were bought, yet the family remained gone. Even more troubling were reports from the few merchants and tradespeople who visited the property. They said they were greeted by Adeline Broussard, who now openly claimed to be Mrs. Whitmore. One milliner, delivering hats ordered months earlier by Elizabeth Whitmore, later wrote that the woman received her in the parlor dressed in Mrs. Whitmore's clothing. She spoke clearly and addressed her as if they had met many times before. When the milliner asked after Mrs. Whitmore, the woman looked at her strangely and said, "I am Mrs. Whitmore." What unsettled her most was not the claim itself, but how naturally the woman seemed to live inside the role. Judge Lambert, deeply disturbed, tried to push for a fuller investigation in January 1849. His efforts were blocked at every step. Local officials did not want to interfere in what they called private plantation affairs. Other judges advised him to drop the matter. During this time, Lambert began writing about what he believed was a conspiracy of silence around the Whitmore case. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, found after Lambert's death in 1852, he wrote that something had happened that no one wished to admit, and that speaking of it might make it real, so people chose instead to pretend nothing was wrong. The most disturbing development came in February 1849, when a daguerreotype photograph was taken at the Whitmore plantation during a dinner attended by nearby plantation owners. The image, which appeared in a private collection in 1931, shows what looks like a formal dinner party. Sitting at the head of the table is not Samuel Whitmore, but Adeline Broussard, dressed in fine clothing. Even more unsettling is that none of the white guests around the table appear to find anything strange about this. According to an analysis done in 1934 by Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University, the faces of the dinner guests show no sign of discomfort or confusion. They are smiling, talking, and raising their glasses. The African-American woman wearing Elizabeth Whitmore's clothes is treated as if she truly is the lady of the house. By March 1849, Judge Lambert's continued inquiries had drawn dangerous attention. He reported receiving anonymous threats, and his home was vandalized. In April, he was removed from his position on claims of mental instability. Soon after, he moved to New Orleans, taking his private Whitmore records with him. The most detailed account of what may have happened to the Whitmore family came from an unexpected source. In 1865, after the Civil War ended, a former slave from the nearby Bradford plantation named Isaiah Cooper gave testimony to a Union Army officer about conditions in the newly freed areas. Cooper's statement, kept in military archives until 1948, described events from the night of August 1, 1848, 3 weeks before Richard Caldwell found the abandoned Whitmore carriage. Cooper said he was present at the Whitmore plantation that night, and that what happened had been building for years. Master Whitmore, he said, had a special kind of cruelty, not he kind that leaves marks on the skin, but the kind that breaks something inside a person. Miss Adeline, he said, suffered more than most. Cooper explained that Adeline Broussard had been bought by Samuel Whitmore in 1842. She had previously belonged to a French family in New Orleans, was educated, and spoke both English and French with ease. Whitmore bought her to serve as his wife's personal maid, but Cooper believed he had other motives. What Whitmore did to Miss Adeline over the years changed her, Cooper said, not suddenly but slowly, like water wearing down stone. One day he noticed that something in her eyes was simply gone. The night of August 1st began, according to Cooper, with an elaborate dinner prepared by Adeline. The entire Whitmore family was there. Nothing seemed wrong until after the meal, When the family began to show signs of distress, they grabbed at their throats, their eyes wide and bulging. Master Whitmore looked straight at Miss Adeline as if he finally understood. "Do something." Miss Adeline, Cooper said, just sat there watching them, calm and still. Cooper's account suggests that Adeline Browsard poisoned the entire Whitmore family that night. What happened afterward moves from disturbing to almost impossible to understand. Miss Adeline gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen and told them that the Whitmores had gone to visit family in Natchez, and that she would manage the household while they were away. Cooper said that what he could never explain was how everyone simply nodded, as if this was normal, as if they had not just witnessed what he had seen. Cooper described how Adeline carefully arranged for the bodies to be disposed of, ordering several trusted field slaves to bury the Whitmore family in the swampy land at the far eastern edge of the plantation, an area few people ever visited because of its harsh conditions. After that night, Cooper said, it was as if the Whitmores had never existed. Miss Adeline began wearing Mrs. Whitmore's skull. Others and sleeping in her bed, first only among the slaves, and later even when visitors came. She greeted them as if she were truly the lady of the house. The most unsettling part of Cooper's testimony was how neighboring plantation owners and Baton Rouge society reacted. White guests came to dinner, sat at her table, and spoke with her as if she were one of them. Cooper said they were not fooled. They knew who she was. It was as if they chose not to see the truth, because pretending was easier. His account suggests a shared denial, or perhaps a silent agreement, that allowed white society to accept Adeline Browsard as Elizabeth Whitmore rather than face the terrifying reality of what had occurred. Judge Lambert, in his final known writing before his death, perhaps explained it best. He wrote that they could not admit what had happened without admitting what came before it, and that this was something they simply could not face. After 1850, the historical record becomes increasingly broken and unclear. The Whitmore plantation continued to function, seemingly under the control of Adeline Browsard, even though all official paperwork still carried the name and signature of Samuel Whitmore. Business partners who had dealt with Whitmore for many years continued their dealings through Adeline, often referring to her in letters as the person acting on behalf of the Whitmore interests. In 1853, a fire swept through much of the main house on the Whitmore plantation. No deaths were recorded. Afterward, the property was rebuilt, though on a smaller and less grand scale. Work on the plantation continued as before. When the Civil War began in 1861, cotton production across the South was badly disrupted. Records from this time are limited, but tax documents show that the Whitmore plantation remained in operation, though at a reduced level. After the Union victory and the freeing of enslaved people, the Whitmore property, like many plantations in the South, entered an uncertain period. What makes this case so unusual is that there was no white owner left to abandon the land or attempt to reshape it under a new labor system. Local land records show that in 1866 the Whitmore plantation was officially transferred to a woman named Mrs. Adelaide White, identified in the documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was handled by the same bank that had managed the Whitmore accounts for decades. After this point, Adeline Browsard no longer appears in any official records. Adelaide White is listed in the 1870 census as the owner of a small but productive farm on land that once belonged to the Whitmores. She is described as a widow with no children. The most unsettling addition to this story comes from interviews conducted in 1929 by folklorist Margaret Dunar, who is gathering oral histories across Louisiana. Dunar spoke with several elderly residents of East Baton Rouge Parish, including a 94-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor. Taylor claimed she had been a house slave on a nearby plantation during the time of the Whitmore incident. Her account largely supported the testimony of Isaiah Cooper, but added an important detail. According to Taylor, the silence surrounding what happened at the Whitmore plantation was not based only on fear or denial. It was not just that people pretended not to see. Some of them, especially the wives, understood exactly what had happened. They sat with her, drank tea with her, and talked about household matters, fully aware of who she was and what she had done. Taylor said that in their eyes there was something like respect. When asked to explain further, Taylor reportedly said that there were other wives who wished they could do what Adeline had done, not only to gain freedom, but to make those who harmed them suffer. They lived through her actions. That was why they protected her and why they accepted her as Mrs. Whitmore. In another life, she said, perhaps they could have done the same. The last known W.R. It, in reference to the Whitmore case, appears in a private letter from 1936. It was written by Edward Lambert, the grandson of Judge Martin Lambert, to a colleague in the history department at Louisiana State University. In the letter, he refused a request to publish his grandfather's notes on the case. Some stories, he wrote, once spoken cannot be taken back. He said his grandfather spent the rest of his life haunted not by what happened at the Whitmore plantation, but by what it revealed about the society around him. Some truths are too frightening to face, and so people create careful lies to avoid them. The Whitmore case, he wrote, was not just about one family and one woman, but about an entire society's ability to deceive itself. Adelaide White died in 1882. Parish records state that she was buried in a small cemetery located on what had once been the eastern edge of the Whitmore plantation. Her grave marker, recorded in a 1954 survey of historical sites, carried only her name and T.W.O. dates. In 1962, during construction for what would later become Interstate 10, workers digging in swampland that had once been part of the Whitmore property uncovered human remains. According to a brief police report, 5 skeletons were found. There were 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals whose gender could not be determined. The remains were estimated to have been buried for more than 100 years. No deeper investigation followed. The bones were later reburied in an unmarked area of Highland Cemetery. The land that once made up the Whitmore plantation has since been divided, developed, and absorbed into the growing city of Baton Rouge. Nothing remains of the original buildings. There are no historical markers to note what occurred there. If not for scattered records, private journals, and spoken memories that survived, the story of Samuel Whitmore and Adeline Broussard might have vanished completely, becoming just another silence in a past full of them. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is not only what was done, but how an entire community could agree to accept an impossible story rather than face a truth they could not bear. It reminds us that one of the most frightening parts of human nature is not our actions, but our refusal to see. Today, if you drive along Interstate 10 just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Whitmore family was buried. Thousands of people travel this road every day, unaware of what lies beneath. Like the society that once chose not to see Adeline Broussard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we move through places shaped by histories we have agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to stay buried. They rise again like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They speak to us through old papers and faded photographs. They remind us that the most horrifying acts are not supernatural but human, and perhaps the most unsettling question of all is how many other Adeline Broussard have been erased from history, and how many unbearable truths we have chosen not to see. The final entry in Judge Lambert's journal, dated January 18, 1852, just 3 months before his death, reads, "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look straight at them and see nothing at all." In 1965, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian who specialized in antebellum Louisiana, tried to publish a full study of the Whitmore case. Her research used many of the same sources mentioned here, but it faced strong resistance from universities and local historical groups. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being set aside indefinitely. This was not because of discomfort with slavery itself, which has been widely studied and acknowledged, but because the Whitmore case represented something far more threatening. It showed a complete reversal of the social order that had been quietly accepted by the very society it challenged. Perhaps most revealing was the reply Pritchard received from the East Baton Rouge Historical Society when she asked for any records related to the Whitmore family or plantation. Writing to a colleague at Tulane University, she said there remained a strong desire in certain circles to keep this history hidden. The society's director responded "WI," a short note stating that no such family existed in their archives. This deliberate erasure goes beyond simple neglect. as late as 1958, when what were likely the original foundations of the Whitmore Plantation House were uncovered during construction. Local newspapers described them only as colonial-era ruins of unknown origin. One of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting the reality of the Whitmore-Brassard case appeared in 1966, when renovations at the First Bank of Baton Rouge revealed a hidden compartment in what had once been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather folder containing bank records from 1848 to 1853. These documents, now kept in the Louisiana State Archives and available only with special permission, include ledger entries for the Whitmore account signed in two clearly different handwriting styles, both claiming to be Samuel Whitmore. Experts later confirmed that the earlier signatures match known examples of Whitmore's writing from before August 1848. While the later ones appear to be careful imitations, even more revealing are the changes in how the account was managed after August 1848. Before that time, withdrawals were mostly for business costs, with regular transfers to merchants in New Orleans and textile makers in Massachusetts. Afterward, while plantation work continued, new patterns appeared. There were smaller, regular cash withdrawals, and notably, purchases of medical books and French-language texts from a New Orleans bookstore. In 1850, the records show payment to a tutor from New Orleans, described as providing lessons on the plantation twice a week. That same year, there are payments to a dressmaker, a jeweler, and an importer of fine French goods, expenses that suggest the building of a new identity rather than the upkeep of an old one. The bank records also show that in 1851, the Whitmore account paid for freedom papers for 3 individuals listed only as former property of nearby estates. This unusual act, using plantation profits to free enslaved people owned by others, appears to have gone without comment by bank officials. Most significant is a note from November 1852 about the creation of a separate account in the name of White, with funds transferred from the Whitmore holdings. This marks the beginning of the financial shift that would lead to the official transfer of the plantation to Adelaide White in 1866. Together, these records suggest not a sudden collapse of the social order, but a slow and careful rebuilding of identity. This process required the cooperation, or at least the chosen blindness, of bankers, merchants, officials, and community members over many years. The question that has troubled researchers ever since is how this could happen. How could an enslaved woman kill her owners and step into the role of plantation mistress, even imperfectly, without immediate discovery or punishment? In a 1953 study of antebellum power structures, Dr. Marcus Freeman suggested that the ICT nature of slave society itself made this possible. The system relied so heavily on fixed racial roles that when faced with something that broke those rules, many people simply could not accept what they were seeing. It was easier to join a shared lie than to face a truth that threatened the foundations of their world. This idea is supported by fragments from the period. A letter from Eliza Bradford, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, written to her sister in Virginia in October 1849, makes a vague reference to the strange situation at the Whitmore estate. She notes that they had all found it more comfortable to accept what was presented to them than to look too closely into matters better left alone. The silence was not limited to the white community. Isaiah Cooper's testimony suggests that most of the enslaved people on the Whitmore plantation also helped maintain the story that nothing had changed, that the Whitmore family was simply away. This may have begun in fear, but Cooper hinted at something deeper, a shared understanding that speaking the truth would bring swift and brutal punishment, not only to Adeline, but to all of them. "We all knew," Cooper told the Union officer. "Every slave on that plantation knew. But to speak it would destroy it. And some of us wanted to see how far it could go, how long the white folks would choose not to see what was right in front of them." The daguerreotype from February 1849 remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case. Modern analysis in 1969 confirmed that the woman seated at the head of the table is of African descent, though dressed in the finest European fashion of the time. Even more striking are the faces of the white guests. They show not fear or disgust, but what appears to be genuine social ease. Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, suggested that the guests may have been experiencing what she called selective reality, a form of shared denial in which a group silently agrees to see a situation in a way that protects their understanding of the world. Instead of seeing a former slave who had killed her owners and taken their place, a truth too dangerous to accept, they saw something their minds could manage. They saw a slightly unusual but still familiar scene, dining with the representative of the Whitmore family. Monroe wrote that the human mind is extremely skilled at reshaping reality when the alternative is too painful to face. This idea is supported by accounts from the time that describe dealings with Adeline Broussard, later known as Adelaide White, in carefully unclear terms. A business associate wrote in 1850 about meeting the lady of the house, who spoke for the Whitmore interests with remarkable clarity and understanding for someone of her station. The choice of words shows both awareness and refusal. From these fragments emerges the image of a community acting out a complex performance. Everyone knew their role, yet no one admitted the script. Plantation owners, merchants, bankers, and enslaved people all took part in maintaining a story that allowed them to survive a situation that, if faced directly, would have demanded violence. The years after the Civil War add another troubling layer, as Adelaide White's move from representing the Whitmore interests to legally owning the land mirrors the wider upheaval of Reconstruction. In this time of great change and uncertainty, the story that had been maintained for almost 20 years could finally be reshaped, not by admitting the truth, but by turning it into a new and more acceptable version. Adelaide White appears in the 1870 census listed as a widow and a property owner of mixed race. Her neighbors, based on tax records, included former plantation owners who were now working much smaller pieces of land than they once controlled. The story shifted again. She was no longer seen as a white plantation mistress, but instead as a free woman of color who had somehow gained land. This was unusual but not impossible during the Reconstruction era. Church records from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Baton Rouge list Adelaide White as a regular member and donor from 1867 until her death. Those same records make no mention of Adeline Broussard, and they also do not mention the Whitmore family, even though that family had been well known in the community for decades before they vanished. The most moving artifact from Adelaide White's later life is a daguerreotype taken around 1875. It was discovered in 1948 by a family descended from formerly enslaved people from the neighboring Bradford Plantation. The image shows an elderly woman of African descent, simply dressed but sitting with dignity in a chair on the porch of a small farmhouse. Notes found with the photograph say that the woman was known locally as Madam White and was respected for her knowledge of herbal remedies. She was said to treat both black and white residents of the area. The notes do not mention her past, only that she came into her land after the war and was known for helping former slaves get started through small loans and gifts of seed and animals. If this image truly shows Adeline Broussard in her final identity as Adelaide White, it suggests that she did more than survive. She created a new life that allowed her to live openly, if not fully honestly, until her death. The change from enslaved woman to plantation mistress and then to respected landowner represents an extraordinary movement through the dangerous racial and social barriers of 19th century Louisiana. Adelaide White died on September 12, 1882. Parish records list her cause of death as complications related to age. Her will, an unusually detailed document for someone who had once been considered property herself, divided her modest estate among several local families, many of them formerly enslaved. The will makes no mention of her life before emancipation. The small cemetery where Adelaide White was buried was relocated in 1959 to make room for highway construction. Her remains, along with others from the site, were moved to Highland Cemetery in Baton Rouge. Cemetery records note that her grave marker, a simple stone reading Adelaide White 1833 to 1882 at rest, was not among those successfully moved. Today, her burial place is unmarked. In the years since, the Whitmore-Broussard case has remained a minor reference in Louisiana history. It is mentioned from time to time in academic writing but rarely explored in depth. The reasons for this continued silence are not hard to understand. The case exposes uncomfortable truths about power, race, and shared denial that still matter today. Dr. Elenina Pritchard, whose attempt to publish a full study of the case in the 1960s failed, wrote in her private journal that the Whitmore case was not just a historical curiosity. She described it as a mirror that shows our own ability to deceive ourselves and our willingness to accept comforting stories instead of facing disturbing truths. This idea becomes even stronger when we consider how the physical evidence of the case was slowly erased. The Whitmore house burned, was rebuilt, and later torn down. The land was divided and developed. The graves were covered. Documents were hidden or destroyed. Even the final resting place of the woman at the center of the story was lost. And yet the story did not disappear. It survived through fragments of paperwork, spoken memories, and the occasional scholar willing to look closely. It survived because, despite all efforts to remove it, the story speaks to something basic about human nature and social systems. In 1964, during an interview for the Federal Writers Project, a 101-year-old woman named Clara Johnson, who had been born into slavery in East Baton Rouge Parish, was asked if she remembered anything about the Whitmore plantation or its owners. After a long pause, she replied that some stories are not meant to be told directly. Some stories live in the spaces between words, in what people choose not to say. She said that people knew what happened at the Whitmore place, but it was easier for them to look away. And sometimes, she said, looking away is its own kind of seeing. Perhaps the most troubling part of the Whitmore-Broussard case is not the original violence, the poisoning of a family by an enslaved woman driven beyond endurance. It is the reaction to that violence. A community chose to support a story rather than face a reality that threatened how they understood their world. This shared denial shows how fragile social structures can be and how hard people will work to protect them, even when faced with clear evidence. In 1968, another piece of the story came to light when a bundle of letters was found during renovations to an old house in New Orleans' Garden District. The letters, written between 1848 and 1851, were exchanged between Elizabeth Whitmore's sister, Caroline Beaumont, and her husband, who was serving as a diplomat in France at the time. In these letters, Caroline repeatedly expressed concern about her sister's family. In September 1848, she wrote that she had heard nothing from Elizabeth since July. She said she had written twice more and even sent a messenger to the plantation, only to be told that the family was traveling. She noted that this behavior was unlike her sister, who disliked leaving home. By November, her worry had deepened. She wrote that she tried to visit the plantation herself, but was met by Elizabeth's maid, Adeline, who insisted the family was away on business. Caroline wrote that there was something about Adeline's manner that unsettled her. She spoke as Elizabeth might have spoken, using familiar phrases. When Caroline asked when the family would return, Adeline smiled in a way that frightened her and said they were never coming back, but that it was better not to discuss it. The most revealing letter came. In January 1849, Caroline wrote that she had shared her fears with Judge Lambert, who agreed that something was very wrong. But when they tried to raise concern, they were met with coldness or anger. She wrote that even more disturbing was a visit to the Bradfords, who claimed they had dined with her sister the previous week. When Caroline insisted this was impossible, Mrs. Bradford became distant and suggested that Caroline herself might be unwell. Caroline's final letter on the matter, dated March 1849, shows her growing isolation. She wrote that she was no longer welcome in Baton Rouge society. Her questions were met with silence or hostility, and even Judge Lambert advised her to let the issue go. She began to doubt her own mind, wondering if she had imagined a mystery that did not exist. Still, she insisted she knew her sister would never disappear without telling her. Something terrible had happened, she wrote, and she seemed to be alone in knowing it. Soon after writing that letter, Caroline Beaumont returned to France to rejoin her husband. There is no record that she ever came back to Louisiana. The Whitmore case appears to have taken not only lives but also the peace of mind of those who could not accept the shared lie. In 24 additional letters found in the same collection, Caroline never again mentioned her sister or the Whitmore family. It is as if, unable to resolve the conflict between what she knew and what society insisted was true, she chose to erase the subject entirely from her writing. This deliberate forgetting reaches beyond individuals and into the historical record itself. The careful removal of the Whitmore-Broussard case from official history represents another form of harm, the harm of allowing comfortable stories to replace difficult truths. Yet despite these efforts, the story survived in fragments, in spoken memory, and in rare academic work willing to face its meaning. It survives because it reveals something essential about human nature and the societies we build. The story of Samuel Whitmore and Adeline Broussard is not just about murder or deception. It is a lesson in shared denial, in our ability to see what we want to see instead of what is truly there. It reminds us that reality is not only what exists, but what we choose to accept. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that this tendency is not limited to the past. We also live with stories that help us avoid painful truths. We also look away. And like the society that refused to see Adeline Broussard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we may not recognize our own illusions until long after they have shaped our lives. The final words on the Whitmore-Broussard case may belong to Judge Martin Lambert, who wrote shortly before his death that the most frightening part of the affair was not what it revealed about Adeline Broussard or even about slavery itself, but what it revealed about all of us. Our willingness, he wrote, to accept a lie instead of facing a truth that upsets our sense of order is something that lives quietly in every human heart, waiting for the moment when reality becomes too painful to face. Today, the city of Baton Rouge has expanded over the land where these events occurred. Highways, shopping centers, and neighborhoods have erased all visible signs of the Whitmore plantation. Thousands pass over this ground each day, unaware that it once witnessed a remarkable challenge to the social order of the time. Like the people who once chose to support Adeline Broussard's fiction, we move through places shaped by histories we have chosen to forget. But some stories refuse to stay hidden. They rise again like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They speak through old letters and faded images. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural, but human. And that sometimes the most frightening monsters are not the ones we see, but the ones we refuse to acknowledge.